Tonight, we won't walk among marble halls or echoing courts. Instead, we'll stand in a northern village, where roofs drip with rain and the earth smells of iron and pine. The night here doesn't arrive, it gathers, slow and damp, like breath against a window. Somewhere beyond the longhouses, a door creaks. A mound of stone exhales mist, the kind that doesn't rise or fall, only lingers. They say the dead in this place were never fully gone, only persuaded. Every burial was a negotiation, every prayer a contract signed in whispers. The villagers spoke softly, not from fear, but from etiquette. You never wanted to wake someone who might still be deciding whether to stay buried. So lower the lights. Let the sound of the rain lean close. And if your breathing begins to match the rhythm of drops sliding down turf and wood, that's just the north listening back. If quiet nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next oath will find you there. And somewhere in that hush, the story exhales. You can almost hear it beneath the turf, the weight of names, the slow settling of a body that isn't quite convinced it's finished living. The rain keeps time like a drum softened by moss. In the longhouse, a single lamp flickers and every shadow leans closer, listening for the first promise that keeps the dead still. That is where we begin, not with mourning, but with memory that refuses to lie still. Around the long fire, the older people repeat the rules so often that even the dozing dogs know them. Do not cheat the dead. Do not steal from the mound. Do not forget to close the eyes. It is a little like modern terms of service. Nobody reads the full list, but everyone has a vague sense that you really should not click "I agree" and then summon a corpse. Children half listen as they slide toward sleep, learning that if you treat the dead with care, they will usually respond by not walking across your roof at midnight. The word Draugr itself is spoken slowly, with the same tone one might use for unpaid invoice or leftover fish stew left out too long. They tell of the few mounds that grew restless when promises were broken, a shield taken without permission, a servant dismissed without wages, a son who forgot to say the right words. The details are deliberately repetitive. The way you repeat, lock the door before bed, even though you locked it an hour ago. It is not horror so much as household management. If you are still awake at this point, you are already doing better than some of the villagers, and you may, very sleepily, follow the series if you like, though you are under absolutely no obligation. Subscribing to the burial etiquette is voluntary, unlike taxes, hauntings, and the onset of winter. As they sit by the hearth, the people stitch story and rule together. Do not let the corpse see the front door, an aunt reminds, not because the door is dramatic, but because doors are for the living and pathways matter. Do not let its nails point toward home, another says, as though they are correcting the angle of spoons in a drawer. Every tiny deed is a thread in an invisible fence that, if properly woven, keeps a Draugr exactly as ambitious as a pile of stones. When someone dies, the tempo slows further. There is washing to be done. This is not rushed. Warm water, cloth, a little scented herb if anyone has been hoarding some, though nobody says so out loud. Eyes are pressed shut, gently held there for a few slow breaths, both as a last kindness and as a kind of hint. Look forward, not back. The scenery behind you is no longer in service. If the lids will not stay down, they are persuaded with love, or in some cases with a strip of linen, a solution also used to keep loose thatch from flapping. The shoes are tied on firmly, because the dead have a reputation for walking. The idea is that if they do wander, they should at least be properly shod. This too is practical. A restless ancestor tromping around barefoot would be embarrassing. Nails in the coffin or the planks of the burial chamber are sometimes turned inward, as if the very wood is politely declining to open in the wrong direction. It feels like overkill. That is exactly the point. The body is carried out, not always by the usual doorway. In some farms, they open a special gap in the wall, a corpse door used once and then sealed. The route is made strange on purpose. It is like clearing your browser history so thoroughly that even your own ghost cannot find the back button. The carriers step sideways, turn corners, follow a path that makes no efficient sense at all. The corpse sees none of the usual signposts of home. Once the body is gone, the special opening is blocked with stones, clay, or a memory of urgency. The family does not use it again. Over the next days, it simply becomes part of the wall, like a decision nobody wishes to revisit. Future children grow up hearing, "We do not open that spot. That is where your great-grandfather left." As bedtime policies go, it is stricter than screen time limits and about as negotiable. Out at the grave mound, the work becomes pleasantly methodical. The earth is tamped to a firmness that would impress any responsible gardener. Goods are laid out not as random treasures, but as a quiet spreadsheet of continuing obligations. A sword, if the dead liked swords. A ring, if the dead liked being paid. Some food, because nobody wants a hungry Draugr, and because even in death, hospitality matters. There is a subtle philosophy here. Give the dead enough to manage their own afterlife, and they will be too busy minding their own business to check on yours. It is the mythic equivalent of giving a retired relative an allotment garden, some knitting, and the monthly newsletter. Sometimes someone leans in close to speak, not dramatically, but in the tone used to discuss winter fodder. "Here's your place," they say. "We honor you here. Your share is in this mound. Ours is in the hall." They might specify that the farm is to be guarded, that the borders are to be watched, that no one is to cross a certain line without the dead man as disapproval resting heavily on their conscience. It sounds like flattery, but it is really delegation. The Draugr is being offered a job with benefits. Stay in your barrow, be spiritually unionized, and in return, your descendants will tell stories about you that make you seem taller and only slightly less stubborn than you really were. In some sagas, the living even swear oaths over the mound, promising to remember debts, to avenge insults, to behave in ways that will not embarrass the one beneath the turf. These speeches are convenient because if things go wrong later, the community has an explanation ready. Well, of course we were cursed. Someone must have broken the pact. It is much more satisfying than admitting that storms and famines operate on their own timetable. The mound becomes a witness, the grass-covered equivalent of a notary public, only quieter and with more beetles. The seasons turn and the mounds sit, mostly uneventful, which is ideal. A perfect Draugr story, from the villager's point of view, is one in which nothing ever happens. The dead person does not get up. They do not speak through dreams, tap on windows, or rearrange furniture. Children pass the burial field on their way to gather berries and feel nothing more, sinister than the mild urge not to step exactly on the center of the hump. Sheep graze across it with their small, thoughtless feet. Snow falls evenly, smoothing every contour. Night after night, the longhouse fills with breathing, turning bodies. No footsteps on the roof. No heavy hand at the latch. Just an occasional snore that, if you're imaginative, could belong to anyone. But the rules are repeated because repetition is the true magic here. Do not disturb the grave goods. Do not speak ill of the dead where they used to sit. Close doors properly. Pay workers on time, especially if those workers are large relatives with axes and established interest in haunting. The customs are practical, but wrapped in superstition so that no one forgets them. You could think of it as a community-wide productivity system. Instead of color-coded calendars, they have corpse doors and muttered promises. Both approaches rest on the same idea. If you line up enough tiny habits, larger disasters may be politely discouraged. On rare evenings, when someone thinks they hear a thump beyond the walls, attention drifts back to the mounds. Was a ring missing? Was a grave robbed? Did a cousin borrow something shiny, intending to return it, and then misplace it in a kitchen drawer behind the spoons? The alleged signs of pact breaking are wonderfully mundane. Hoofbeats with no rider, which is really just what happens when horses get bored. A weight on the roof, which could be a cat, snow, or a cat made of snow. The sense of a cold presence at the door, also known as February. Yet each of these can be promoted gently into proof that some small social debt has been neglected. The cure is never a heroic quest. It is very soothingly paperwork. Villagers go out to the mound by lantern light and adjust the contract. Maybe they replace the missing ring or add another. Maybe they speak an apology toward the turf. Someone might pour ale, hoping the dead are as susceptible to refreshments as the living. They reaffirm the boundary lines. This pasture yours, this hall ours, that hill belonging to no one in particular, but strongly associated with sheep. In doing so, they are really reassuring themselves that the world is arranged, that cause and effect are not entirely random, that a restless noise in the night has a known address. The Draugr remains mostly theoretical, like a clause in an insurance policy that is never actually tested. For us, watching from a comfortable distance and perhaps lying under our own blankets with modern worries humming faintly, there is something strangely peaceful in their insistence. Instead of chaos, they choose procedure. Instead of dramatic hauntings, they prefer well-behaved ghosts who stay within zoning regulations. Even their monsters, when you look closely, are simply people who expect their things to be left where they put them. You might find this relatable, especially if anyone has ever borrowed your charger. Late in the telling, someone by the hearth suggests an explanation that is not very supernatural at all. Maybe all these corpse doors and turned nails, these oaths over mounds and whispered boundaries, were never truly about terrifying Draugr stomping around like soggy warriors. Perhaps they were bedtime tools for adults. Ways to wrap ethical behavior in stories. Ways to say, pay what you owe, and honor agreements, and do not loot the past. The fear of being haunted just made everyone a little more thorough. A culture of very careful goodbyes, so the night in the village stretches on. Rain taps on the turf roof with a steady, almost metronomic patience. The fire settles into a long, embered sigh. In the burial field, the mounds hold their shape, slightly damp, faintly fragrant with earth and yesterday's flowers. Under one of them, a warrior, or a farmer, or an ant who disliked giraffes, lies surrounded by the objects chosen for them, a ring that will not be moved, a spear that will not be swung, a contract no one is inclined to test. The pact holds, not because of blazing runes or shouted spells, but because everyone prefers a quiet night. And if somewhere far off, someone imagines a shape standing by its own grave, checking the edges like a landowner inspecting a fence, even that figure is calm. The terms are clear. The oaths are intact. The house is in order. There is nothing pressing to do. If it turns its head toward the lone house, it finds the windows dark, the doors shut, the path from its last journey already blurred by grass and time. A slow breath of wind rearranges a few blades, erases a footprint that might have been its own, or might have been nothing at all. The Draugr's pact, like the listener's waking thoughts, softens at the edges, loses urgency, and sinks back into the mound, leaving only the sound of the rain, and the sense that as long as small promises are kept, everything important will stay exactly where it is supposed to be. Resting, resting, resting. You might not think the quietest sound in a Norse village would be a promise made to someone who has stopped breathing, but that is where the evening settles in the pause between the last breath and the first shovelful of earth. The hall is dim, the fire is folding itself into orange, and outside the turf roof the rain thinks about starting and then politely delays. No one is in a particular hurry. Death has already been punctual. Now the people are dealing with what really matters to them, terms and conditions. Not livestock, not inheritance, not even who gets the good bench. They are concerned with the Draugr, the stubborn dead who occasionally decline to stay in their allotted plots. It sounds dramatic from a distance, but up close it is domestic. A Draugr is not an elegant wisp. It is a swollen, disgruntled homeowner auditing his own grave goods. This is less ancient horror and more very committed landlord. And like all landlords, he is easiest to manage when everything was written down properly at the beginning. The older villagers murmur stories in the longhouse, not to frighten anyone, but the way people recite recipes. Slowly, reliably, knowing the rhythm will put the children to sleep before the climax. They say that some warriors, especially the strongly opinionated ones, lay down and did not lie still. They rose again, heavy and blue, sitting on their mounds, watching their own swords and ships in silver, in case any cousin developed an enterprising mood. Not every mound did this. It apparently took a specific combination of unpaid debts, unresolved insult, and perhaps an unfortunate personality. Still, no one wanted to experiment. It was easier to behave as if any dead neighbor might have the potential to file an after-hours complaint. The very word Draugr drifts through the hall like a label on a storage chest. Contents, strength, resentment do not open. So the rules were told and retold. Around the fire, instructions folded into anecdotes. How you carry the body, how you speak to it, which door it may see, which thresholds it must never cross. Children listening from the bedding in the shadows absorbed each point, the way one absorbs the correct way to stack firewood or the collective opinion on watered ale. Never let the corpse see the front door, an aunt says, as she has said for 30 years. Never let its nails point home, an uncle adds, although he cannot remember why, only that his grandfather said it and seemed satisfied. The customs sound small and oddly fussy. That is the intention. In a world where wintering kings are loud and uncontrollable, it is soothing to have a list of tiny, precise tasks that, if performed correctly, promise peaceful nights. If you are somehow still awake and tracking all of this, you may quietly choose to follow the series. If you fall asleep halfway through the phrase funerary nail orientation, the Draugr will understand. When someone dies, the longhouse does not erupt into wailing chaos. It shifts into this deliberate, careful mode, like a household that has gone from conversation to sewing. The body is washed with slow strokes, not only to show respect, but also to make sure there is no unfinished business clinging to the skin in the form of dirt, sweat, or yesterday's soup. Eyes are pressed shut with 2 fingers and a murmur, a simple gesture that serves both as kindness and hint. Please look forward. That way lies your mound, your view, your eternal job. The kitchen is no longer your concern. If the eyelids are stubborn, a thin strip of cloth lends support. The mouth is gently closed because leaving it open makes it look like the dead are about to say something. And frankly, nobody wants new instructions from someone who has already checked out. The dressing follows. Grave clothes are chosen with almost bureaucratic logic. Not the ragged tunic, not the stained trousers someone meant to mend. They pick garments that say, "This person has finished traveling." Shoes are tied firmly. It is worth noting that the Norse regularly put shoes on their dead. You might assume this is to help them walk in the next world. That is generous. It also ensures that if, hypothetically, they try to walk back, they will not do it barefoot like an impolite teenager. The nails that fasten coffin boards, or the timbers of a chambered grave, are set with their sharp ends pointed inward. People will quietly explain that this makes it harder to break out. No one mentions the obvious. That also gives nervous gravediggers something constructive to do. Then comes the root. There is often a special opening in the wall, made only for this purpose, a corpse door. For the living, doors are continuity. You go out and in and out, carrying milk and gossip. For the dead, continuity is precisely what you do not want. So they are led out by a path they never used in life. Carriers turn left where they would always have turned right, step sideways through low gaps, pass behind the bier rather than in front. It is less epic procession, more scenic detour. Once the body is gone, the corpse door is sealed with stones or earth, or a particularly decisive plank. It is never casually reopened. Years later, children will be told, "We do not use that place in the wall. That is where your great-grandfather left." It becomes a permanent no-click zone. The original, "Do not reopen this tab." Out at the mound site, the funeral looks peaceful, but what is happening is a delicate negotiation. Earth is heaped, firm enough that it says, politely, "We believe you will stay." Goods are placed in careful order, not flung. A sword at the side, a spear at hand, some silver, a cloak, a comb. Everything that says, you have what you need. You do not, under any circumstances, need to come back into the longhouse to look for that knife you liked. The arrangement is less about flaunting wealth and more about fulfilling the clauses of a contract that everyone pretends is entirely one-sided, even though they all know it is not. If there's one thing worse than a Draugr, it is a Draugr with itemized grievances. People speak then in low voices. Not grand speeches, just tidy sentences that float down and press themselves into the soil. "We lay you here," they say, "and we respect this place as yours. Guard the boundary, if you will. Keep the farm under your eye, if you must. But let your feet remain in this earth. It is flattery with a purpose." The dead are addressed like retired chiefs offered honorary titles. High respect, 0 actual meetings. The family promises things too. Debts to pay, feuds to manage, widows and children to feed. These are not only moral commitments, they are also a hedge against spectral HR complaints. A contented ancestor, like a satisfied auditor, does not schedule follow-up visits at inopportune hours. Some stories say that over certain mounds, the living pledge more pointed oaths. Brothers swear to avenge an insult. Allies vow to hold a border. Households promise to keep the farm prosperous, so the dead do not feel their legacy being slowly discounted. It is easy, listening to these long strings of vows, to see how a simple burial can expand into an all-purpose motivational seminar. Stand straight, be brave, pay your people. Also, do not get haunted. The silence that answers from the mound is taken as agreement, or at least as non-objection. It is very hard for anyone to argue with you when they have been carefully interred under several cubic meters of topsoil and promised a comfortable status as guardian emeritus. Time passes in the way it likes best, slowly and repetitively. The grass knits over the mound. Sheep drift across it, blissfully unaware that they are trotting on clauses and codicils. Children dare each other to run past at dusk and then stop daring because nothing happens, which is, ironically, the truest success of the system. A good Draugr story is one that never needs to be told because nobody saw anything. Night after night, the longhouse fills with the sound of people doing very ordinary things, rolling over, sighing, coughing quietly, wondering if there is any dried fish left. The mound lies still, a big sleepy punctuation mark at the edge of the fields. Yet the rules are reiterated with the persistence of a bedtime mantra. Do not take weapons from the dead. Do not skimp when you lay out their ship. Do not speak mockingly of someone within earshot of their old bed. Do not sell the grave plot to a stranger just because it has good drainage. All remarkably practical for a system that involves undead litigation. There's a kind of gentle humor in it. These big battle-scarred people using elaborate ghost protocols essentially to remind one another to clean up after themselves and pay what they owe. Instead of posting a sign that says, "Remember to be decent," they tell their children, "If you are not decent, your sword-collecting uncle may climb out of his barrow and file a negative review of your life choices." Every so often, something goes wrong or seems to Perhaps a grave is robbed by outsiders who did not get the memo, or a debt remains unpaid, or a promise to support a widow is quietly forgotten under new priorities, like acquiring a more fashionable cloak clasp. Then people notice unusual noises, hoofbeats without riders on the turf roof, a cold weight leaning on the door in the dark, cattle shying away from the burial field. Each of these phenomena has at least 3 sensible explanations: bored horses, bad weather, cows being cows. But the community does not choose sensible explanations at first. It chooses the Draugr, not because it loves melodrama, but because blaming the Draugr leads logically to a review of outstanding responsibilities. It is a ritualized way of asking, what have we left undone? So they go back to the mound in ones or twos, carrying a lamp. They stand there in the damp grass and talk as though to a neighbor whose window is closed. If something was missing, we have brought it back, they say. If a promise was thin, we thicken it. Maybe they restore a sword. Maybe they add new gifts, a ring, a cloak, some carefully folded cloth that smells faintly of smoke and regret. Someone sprinkles ale on the mound side, in case the dead appreciate refreshments more than explanations. In all of this, the tone stays practical, almost tender. They are not fighting a monster. They are mending a contract with an elder who has gone extremely offline. Of course, the sagas also preserve more colorful tales. Barrel breakers wrestling with blue-faced corpses for gold, heroes swinging swords in underground chambers, dragons doing freelance treasury management. These are exciting, which makes them deeply unsuitable for our present purpose. The everyday villagers would likely listen to such stories, nod once, and then go back to tightening the rules on shoes and nails. Their goal is to ensure that nobody in their immediate vicinity needs to become the protagonist of anything. In that sense, the Draugr Pact is a technology of boredom, a cultural mechanism for making sure the dead stay in their archive folders and the living are free to go on being mildly cold and busy. If you listen long enough, you may notice that everyone quietly prefers the mundane explanation, even for uncanny things. The hoofbeats on the roof become the neighbor's horse after all. The pressing weight at the door is decided to have been snow that slipped. The half-heard voice is downgraded to the wind, arguing with the eaves, yet nobody discards the pact. They keep turning the nails inward, keep sealing corpse doors, keep promising over the mounds, because the rituals are doing more than pacifying hypothetical undead. They are binding the living into predictability. They say, look how seriously we take our word. Look how carefully we conclude a life. Look how even in grief we can be trusted to follow instructions. This is the secretly comforting lesson, one you may let your mind circle around as it grows heavier. In this quiet corner of Norse belief, the world is not governed by sudden chaos. It is managed by extremely specific burial protocols and a mutual agreement to respect them. The Draugr, that terrifying creature of revenge, is also a symbol that the universe notices if you cheat. And if you do not cheat, if you wash the body, close the eyes, lock the unused door, return what you borrowed, speak kindly of the one beneath the stones, then nights will be as they are now in our story. Long, mostly uneventful, punctuated only by the soft sounds of a house breathing. So the rain, which has been thinking about it for some time, finally begins, a fine hiss across the roof, gentle as wool being carded. The lamplight leaks through the smoke hole and fades. The graves on the hill darken, then vanish into the broader dark. In the longhouse, one by one, the last talkers fall silent, their thoughts folding inward like the turned nails in the coffin timber. Outside, no doors open, no corpse door creaks. No heavy footsteps circle the walls. The Draugr's pact is in force, unwritten but fully signed, its clauses held in the careful habits of the living. And with everything agreed, and everyone where they should be, worries grow slow and indistinct, like mounds under snow, and the night goes on holding you quite gently, asking nothing more from you than to lie still. You might not expect the quietest laws in Norse mythology to be written for people who had already stopped attending meetings, but the most patient rules were made for the dead, for the ones who might, in a moment of posthumous enthusiasm, decide to come back inside and check how things were going. Long before anyone sharpened a sword or carved a saga, someone sat in a smoky hall and said, in a very practical tone, "We should agree on what we owe the ones under the mounds, so they are not tempted to stand up and file complaints." It is all much calmer than the later stories make it sound. No flashing lightning, no ominous chanting. Just a rain-soft evening, a bit of lamplight, a body to be attended to, and a village trying to ensure that its nights remain, above all, uneventful. They had heard of Draugr, of course. Everyone had, the way everyone today has heard of that one brand of printer that always jams. The Draugr is the undead neighbor who is not quite finished with their to-do list. Heavy, swollen, more offended than evil, he sits on his own grave goods like a meticulous accountant, making sure nobody converts his treasured sword into a plowshare without the proper authorization. Not every dead person became such a figure. Some, by general consensus, were too kindly, too tidy, too completely paid up. But there were just enough stories of warriors who turned in their graves only to discover that their shield had been regifted, that it seemed responsible to assume potential restlessness in everyone. It was a kind of village-wide risk assessment. Treat them all as if they might get back up. Draft policy accordingly. So Batales began with names. A mound that remembered its occupant's name was a mound with boundaries. Here lies Thorstein, the elders would say, nodding at a grassy rise that looked like any other, except that no one grazed goats on it and no one set their fish-drying rack there, not even temporarily. Names fixed people in place. To forget a name was to blur a line, and blurred lines, it was agreed, were where feet might wander. Around the fire, children listened as adults listed which mounds held which grandfathers, which uncles, which unfortunate guests whose barrows had been built with slightly more distance, just in case. This was genealogy as a security system, endless recitation of who lay where, spoken so steadily that the young ones would drift off before the part where anyone sat back up. Over time, those stories thickened into small instructions, the kind of phrases everyone knows without quite remembering learning them. Carry the body feet first, so it does not try to see the house. Close the mouth, so it does not begin another argument. Do not let the corpse pass through the same doorway it used in life, because doors remember habits. Children heard these reminders in the background of their days, threaded between advice on how to dry fish or stack turf. No one shouted. This was not religion as spectacle. It was housekeeping. In a world of storms and kings and wolves, people found real comfort in knowing that they could at least control which way a corpse was pointed. When someone died, the pace slowed even more, as though the whole farm were taking a deep, methodical breath. The dead were washed carefully, as much to remove the sweat of illness as to smooth away any lingering irritation. You can imagine an old woman wringing out a cloth over a tub, saying, "We will not send him into the mound with dust under his nails." He complained enough about that in life. The eyes were pressed shut, gently but firmly, so that, should there be any trace of awareness left, it would be directed inward toward memory and away from the threshold. If the lids fluttered open again, a small stone or strip of cloth solved the problem, as decisive as a signed form. Then there were the nails. Theirs, of course, trimmed, cleaned, checked, because long blackened nails were the sort of artistic feature that belonged in poetry, not in one's actual storeroom. More importantly, the nails in the wood were turned inward, boards fastened so that their barbed ends pointed into the grave space, into the coffin, like a ring of politely discouraging teeth. No one said they were trapping the dead. That would be rude. Officially, it was to keep the carpentry strong. Unofficially, it made the idea of pushing back out seemed complicated enough that a tired soul might decide to leave it. The route out of the house was perhaps the most endearingly fussy part. A special opening might be cut low in the wall, just wide enough for the body to pass through. Carriers ducked awkwardly, shuffling sideways, navigating corners that had never before served as doorways. It was not dignified, but that was the point. The dead should not recognize their path. Once they were gone, the opening was sealed blocked by a stone, or filled in with timber, or plastered over so thoroughly that only a faint line in the wall remembered. Centuries later, archaeologists would puzzle over these blocked gaps. At the time, everyone knew that it was simply the exit you could use only once. A single-use portal, like clicking log out, and then losing the password. Out of the mound, the preparations became almost cozy. The grave was not only a hole, it was a room being furnished for someone who liked things a certain way. A sword here, a spear there, a cloak folded at the feet, a ring laid in the palm, a comb tucked where the hair would have fallen. They were careful not to overdo it. Too little, and a Draugr might feel insulted. Too much, and he might feel so wealthy that he wanted to get up occasionally just to admire it in different lighting. Moderation was, as usual, the safest policy. The good sent a clear message. You have what you need. You have a role. You are not being cheated. Then came the quiet talk. Someone, usually a relative who had a talent for saying sensible things in bad weather, would speak at the mound. Not poetry for the ages, just careful statements. Your ship is here. Your weapons are here. Your share is here. We will not steal what we have placed with you. We ask that you, in return, watch over the farm from where you lie and do not trouble the doors. It was less a prayer than a negotiation. This is where the series could remind you, if you were improbably still listening, that you might subscribe for more examples of extremely calm supernatural diplomacy, though you are warmly encouraged to fall asleep before you make any decisions. Sometimes the oaths over the mound were almost bureaucratic in their detail. A brother promised to avenge wrongs, so the dead man did not feel obliged to climb out and handle them personally. A son promised to feed his mother, so their ancestor need not worry about abandoned kin. Allies swore to keep an agreed boundary, because no one wanted a Draugr standing on the fence line at midnight performing unpaid border management. These promises sounded fierce when summarized, but in delivery they were soothingly specific. I will give so many measures of grain. I will maintain that wall. I will not sell this land to someone you would not have invited to dinner. It is hard to become a restless corpse when your descendants are micromanaging your estate on your behalf. The offerings matched the oaths, not temptations exactly. More like retainers. A mom might receive a spear, but it was understood to be a spear for guarding, not for roaming. A small hoard of silver might be placed at the dead, a side less to display wealth than to function as a kind of hush fund against dissatisfaction. Here, the good say, if you feel the urge to complain, count these again instead. Some stories insist that greedy barrow-wights still grabbed passers-by, but the more everyday expectation was that a properly provisioned ancestor would be too busy being respectable to bother anyone. Of course, rules do occasionally encounter reality. Maybe a careless nephew borrowed a sword from a grave only for one raid. Perhaps a debt remained embarrassingly unpaid. Perhaps someone told a rude story about the deceased within earshot of his old bed. On such nights, people listened more closely to the sounds that, on other evenings, they would wave away. Hoofbeats on the roof, but no horse when they looked. A pressure against the door, heavy as a remembering hand. A cold draft across the sleeping platform. All of these could be explained by mundane things. Loose boards, praying wind, a horse with independent hobbies. Yet it was more constructive to say the Pact is displeased. It framed the universe as negotiable rather than random. The response was not battle, it was customer service. A family would go to the mound with a lamp and additional apologies. They might replace stolen goods, add a new cloak, pour ale into the grass, and speak clearly into the dark soil. What we forgot, we restore. What we spoke foolishly, we take back. You are not wronged among us. It is hard to think of a gentler approach to the undead. No exorcisms, no shouting in archaic tongues. Just amending the agreement until the night calmed down again. It is almost disappointingly sensible, perfect for sleep. Interestingly, when you look past the moss and the ominous illustrations, the Draugr Pact is less about fear of corpses and more about the ethics of the living. If no one steals from the dead, then perhaps they will also be slower to steal from each other. If everyone believes that unpaid promises echo loudly enough to disturb graves, they may be more diligent in following through in daylight. The idea of the restless dead is like a slightly stern grandmother in mythic form, reminding everyone to sit properly and finish tasks. It gives a supernatural sheen to good bookkeeping. This is how you know a culture is serious about order. It invents ghosts that care about contracts. Over generations, these practices hardened into habit. A child might ask why nails all pointed inward and be told with affectionate exasperation that is simply how it is done, like stirring porridge clockwise or never wasting fish heads. People continued to cut corpse doors even when the original reason had turned vague, because the house did not feel complete without one sealed off, unremarkable square that quietly insisted on one-way travel. The dead, in their mounds, meanwhile, remained impressively quiet, which was widely regarded as proof that the system worked. Success in this field is, after all, the essence of news. Now and then a storyteller would brighten the hall with a livelier tale. The hero who broke into a barrow to wrestle a Draugr and steal its treasure, or the monstrous corpse that grew to giant size and had to be chopped apart. People enjoyed these in the same distant way they enjoyed tales of frost giants and world serpents, then tucked themselves into bed under the ongoing protection of their small, local rules. The wild stories were set elsewhere, or in the past, or around other people's mounds. Here at home, the goal was that nothing astonishing should happen at all. By the time the embers in the hearth have sunk into a red, drowsy glow, the full shape of this mythology lies around you like another blanket. There is the longhouse with its doors properly used, its corpse door properly unused. There are the mounds, each with its remembered name and its correct amount of treasure, and its carefully phrased oaths. There is the understanding that if anything feels slightly wrong in the night, the answer is not panic, but a calm review of promises made, and perhaps a quiet visit with a lamp. It is an entire supernatural system built to reward routine competence and to punish, ever so gently, the failure to return borrowed items. And as the wind moves over the hill, you can imagine the Draugr themselves, or the possibility of them lying in their allotted places, listening to the soft accuracy of the living. No one slams doors. No one jokes too loudly at the edge of the burial field. No one drags furniture over someone's mound. The relationship holds. The restless dead, if they still think, may feel just restless enough to be flattered that so many procedures exist on their behalf, but not so restless as to break them. The pact remains in force as long as people remember how to behave. And people remember, because remembering is easier than getting up to investigate hoofbeats on the roof at midnight. So the stories go on, always in this modest key, circling the same ideas with the persistence of waves nudging ashore. There's no final confrontation, no climactic spell. Only the ongoing reassurance that the living and the dead have come to an understanding precise enough to be boring. An understanding that lets the house exhale, the mounds settle, and your thoughts loosen slowly and steadily until they too lie down in their places and decide, after all, not to rise. You might not think that the quietest people in the village would be the ones who had already been buried, but in Norse belief, the most reliable neighbors were precisely those who had been given a proper, mound a reasonable collection of objects, and a politely binding agreement not to get up again. The living moved around them like tenants in a carefully managed building, obeying regulations no one had signed but everyone understood. There's something almost soothing about how seriously they took it. Before anyone rushed into the loud business of raiding or boasting, someone had sat down on a cool stone, looked at the hills full of ancestors, and said, very gently, "We should decide how to keep all of this peacefully horizontal." In the dim light of the longhouse, where smoke curled upward as slowly as thoughts at the end of a long day, the idea of the Draugr drifted more than it pounced. A Draugr was not always some snarling monster from later illustrations. Often it was imagined like a disgruntled landlord of his own grave, solid, unsmiling, absolutely convinced that the goods buried with him were still his business. The word itself wandered through speech like a warning tag sewn on a shirt. Handle properly, do not remove contents, do not rearrange. The children heard it in stories the way you might hear about expired warranties. Important, but not urgent. The elders emphasized that not everyone became such a being. Only those whose deaths tangled with unfinished accounts, unpaid blood, careless words. Even this condition sounds more like contract law than horror. Very few things in this world were certain, but if you gave the dead what they were due and observed the correct forms, you could be almost certain they would stay where the story left them. So the village learned its rules in small, workable pieces. Nobody distributed a pamphlet. Instead, the habits hid in phrases and examples. When a grandfather died, the children watched how their elders moved. They saw that the body was washed slowly, every fold of cloth arranged as meticulously as if for a journey whose border guards were known to be fussy. They watched someone smooth the beard that had annoyed people for 40 years because the dead, like guests, should not be sent away with crumbs on their shirt. They listened as their aunt murmured over the basin that peaceful faces sleep deeper. This was religion expressed as laundry. It settled into everyone's spine that good care now meant quiet nights later. Then came the closing of the eyes and the turning of the nails. Those tiny gestures that look like superstition if you glance too fast and like a user manual if you keep looking. The eyes, once shut, were encouraged to stay that way with a soft touch. It was not that anyone truly expected them to snap open and glare. It was more that eyes are for seeing roads, and roads, as experience showed, led back to front doors. As for the carpenters, when they hammered nails into coffins or mound timbers, they turned the sharp ends inward, as though the whole structure itself were politely leaning on the dead. Outward pointing nails might invite a hand looking for a grip. Inward nails suggested quietly that getting up would be logistically annoying. It is hard to argue with an architectural discouragement. The path out of the house was chosen with the same sleepy logic. The corpse was not allowed to leave the way a living person would, because that would establish a root, and roots have memories. Instead, a side opening was used, a door that was not a door, cut modestly into a wall. The carriers shuffled through it into the cold air, tilting the stretcher, muttering the kind of practical remarks people make when trying not to stub toes. Keep it level, mind the beam, careful there. Once the body had passed, the opening was sealed so carefully that in a few months it would vanish into the wall. Only the story would remember. A one-time exit like a single-use password. The Draugr, if tempted to stroll, would find his familiar door missing and might decide that returning home required more initiative than eternity was worth. Out of the mound, the earth waited with more patience than anyone inside the house. The grave was not simply a pit. It was arranged like a small, static apartment. The sword was laid at the right side, the shield slightly angled, the cloak folded with domestic steadiness. A ring, a drinking horn, a handful of silver pieces that clinked softly and then never moved again, unless disturbed by roots or archaeologists. They rarely buried chaos. Each item had a clear purpose. Here is what you guard, here is what you enjoy, here is evidence that we understand who you were. The careful point is not lavishness, but correctness. A man known for hoarding would obviously claim a few extra coins. A woman known for hospitality might be buried with her keys. The Draugr, if he ever turned in his grave to inventory his estate, was meant to find the list accurate. Accuracy, more than incense or speeches, kept him content. Over the sealed chamber, the living spoke. Their words were less sermon and more minutes of meeting. They reminded the dead of the agreement. We will not steal from you. We will tend the mound. We will avenge what must be avenged, so you do not have to sit up and handle it. In return, you will lie quiet and keep your watch from there. It is not dramatic. It sounds like checking a contract clause, but there's a gentleness in it too. They treated their difficult debt like valued experts who had been encouraged to retire in comfort, with the strong implication that they need not come back to the office. Sometimes gifts were added that bordered on bribery with a smile. The point, though, was always balance. Too small an offering might feel like disrespect and invite spectral performance reviews. Too extravagant a hoard might attract the wrong sort of sagas, the kind in which heroes show up at inconvenient hours to test themselves on the resident Draugr. Nobody wants their grandfather's final resting place turned into an adventure destination. So the community aimed for a middle line, enough to honor, not enough to advertise. And all these actions were wrapped in language. Words were tools sharp enough to pierce the hill if used foolishly, so people used them neatly. They offered clear, symmetrical phrases. Our share here, your share there. We keep your memory, you keep our boundary. For the ones suspected of a stronger temper in life, the speeches at the mound could become almost humorous in their thoroughness. You were a hard man, they might say, standing in the drizzle, and we have laid your sword here that you may continue your hardness from a seated position. We will mention your name with respect. We will not move your marker. There is, as you see, no need to get up. If any of the listeners felt a shiver, it came more from the wind than from dread. The ritual was, above everything, about achieving a pleasant predictability. But predictability, as the Norse knew far too well, could sometimes be dented. A spear borrowed just once and not returned. A promise to pay someone for a horse delayed past dignity. A mound edged into by plow or path. A drunk cousin telling unwise stories at the feast, laughing a little too much about a dead man's last mistakes. These things frayed the pact in tiny ways, like loose threads on a tightly woven cloak. The tales say that when the agreement thinned, signs appeared. It is striking and very convenient for sleep how modest these signs usually are reported to be. Hoofbeats on the roof, that there is no horse. A heavy, slow weight pressing at the door as if someone has leaned against it and then changed their mind. The impression, just as you are drifting off, that someone strong and dissatisfied has walked the length of the hall and paused exactly where they would have slept in life. All of these are also normal building noises, animal habits, and tricks of circulation. Yet classifying them as signals from a not quite restless ancestor offers a surprisingly gentle explanation. It means the universe is not arbitrary. It is simply reminding you to finish your paperwork. When that happened, the remedy was not warfare. No one gathered a warband to charge the grave. That would have been noisy and worse, unproductive. Instead, the family lit a lamp and went back out to the mound with the quiet embarrassment of people correcting an accounting error. They might bring the missing item or replace something that had been carelessly used. They spoke again, this time more apologetic. What was taken has been restored. Words spoken in foolishness are withdrawn. If you have felt disturbance, please consider this the amended version. It is, in effect, customer service for the dead. Strangely considerate and much calmer than most haunted house stories would like you to believe. Underneath all this is an almost comfortable philosophy. The dead are powerful, yes, but mainly as a reminder that obligations extend beyond your own breathing. A promise broken in daylight might echo at midnight as a creaking beam. So you actually pay the debt, not because you expect a corpse to knock, but because everyone agrees that unpaid things unsettle the air. It is moral bookkeeping with mythological stationery. The Draugr, instead of being random horror, becomes an emblem of consequences. A quiet threat that is also a reassurance. If you live rightly, the hills will not have to file complaints. Over generations, these customs became so ingrained that they no longer needed explaining. Children saw that certain mounds were always walked around, never across, and accepted it the way we accept that some files should not be deleted, just in case. They helped carry food to seasonal feasts where ancestors were toasted in orderly sequence, like a roll call of people who had successfully stayed put. When a new mound was raised, neighbors watched to see that the rules were followed, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of the soothing desire to keep the pattern intact. Even arguments about land might pause politely in front of a barrow, as if the presence of previous stakeholders encouraged everyone to lower their voices. Every so often, a skald would spice up an evening by telling a rare full-blown Draugr saga. In those stories, someone had broken the pact spectacularly, and a corpse had responded with equal theatricality, growing, snorting, wrestling heroes in the moonlight. People listened, nodded, perhaps glanced at their own mounds and noted, with sleepy satisfaction that they had avoided such extremes. The fearful stories functioned the way exaggerated cautionary tales do now, helpful for emphasizing why the regulations, quietly kept, are worth keeping. They weren't the norm. The norm was the peaceful hill, the intact pact, the reassuring absence of footprints. So the night world of these farms was not only dark water and wolf howls. It was also a map of agreements, each mound a signed document under turf. The longhouse door barred for the evening, the fire stacked low, the last ember turning in its ash like a closing eye. Outside, ancestral graves slept under grass. Inside, living bodies lay in ordered rows, mirroring the order outside. Everyone, alive and dead, had a place they were meant to occupy, and a list of things they were expected, or no longer expected, to do. If you picture it long enough, the damp earth, the careful carpentry, the whispered terms spoken into soil, you may notice how few dramatic edges there really are. Even the thread of the Draugr is wrapped in procedure. There is always an action to take. Close the eyes, turn the nails, send the body by the unfamiliar door, place the blade to the right, return what you borrowed, speak again if you must. And if you are listening to this with the light already off, you might feel a faint sympathy for those hypothetical restless dead who, confronted with such a thorough system, would have to work very hard to justify the effort of rising. In that sense, the Draugr's Pact is an ideal bedtime myth. Nothing is conclusively ended. The agreement holds as long as everyone keeps up their side, which is indefinitely, or at least until the listener falls asleep. The hills remain, the mounds breathe only grass, the doors stay shut with their nails pointed the practical way. The villagers murmur their small, tidy promises, night after night, generation after generation. And beneath all that repetition, rhythmical as the sea on a stony shore, lies the soft assurance that so long as care is taken, nothing unexpected needs to climb the steps. The story could go on, circling the same quiet rules forever, while your own thoughts, like dutiful ancestors, find their place, lie down, and stay. You might not expect that one of the quietest. Most sleep-friendly ideas in Norse belief is a kind of legal agreement with the dead, negotiated in whispers over damp soil and pine boards, but that is more or less what it was. Long before anyone drew terrifying illustrations of corpse kings and skeletal warriors, people in the north were already busy with something far more practical and strangely comforting. making sure their departed neighbors had every reason to stay comfortably horizontal. In a world of shifting loyalties and creaking houses and weather that could arrive sideways, it was reassuring to know that the mounds on the hillside followed rules. If you're somehow still awake by the time we reach the part about turning coffin nails inward, you're welcome to follow this channel for more extremely low-intensity mythological contract law. But honestly, nodding off is a much more traditional response. Imagine a farmstead at evening. The longhouse is warm, smoke curling lazily up through the roof slits, the day's noise folded away like cloaks on their pegs. Outside, on a low rise, the burial mounds sit like sleeping animals, their shapes softened by grass and the forgetfulness of sheep. Each mound has a name somewhere inside it, even if the carved stone has tilted or sunk or been borrowed as a chopping block. Families remember which bump in the earth belongs to which ancestor with the same quiet certainty that we remember which mug on the shelf is ours. That is where Thorstein lies. Someone might murmur while fetching water, or do not walk across that one, it is your mother's mother. The mounds make a kind of map of remembered obligations. Old stories say that some of those who lay there were not entirely at rest, that if things were done incorrectly, a Draugr might rise, not a random monster, but a person with opinions still strongly attached to their property, their promises, and their general standard of service. It is less an outbreak of horror than an escalation of customer feedback to avoid that escalation. Customs grew as neatly as frost patterns on a window. Children learned them in pieces, half story and half instruction. They heard how certain dead men would not lie still if their weapons were stolen, so weapons were buried carefully within reach of hands that would never reach. They heard that a greedy chieftain, buried with much but cheated of a little, might feel the missing coin like a pebble in a shoe. They learned that a Draugr was not simply a ghost. It was a word for a solid, stubborn, wronged dead person who had found a technicality. This is, admittedly, a very Norse approach to the afterlife. Even beyond death, procedure matters. When a person died, the household did not rush. There was a rhythm to it, measured and oddly tender. The body was washed, slowly, with hands that knew every line of the face and every old scar. Water sloshed in a wooden tub, warm for as long as somebody remembered to keep it so. Hair and beard were combed, not to impress any divine audience, but to ensure that when the dead turned metaphorically to check themselves, they could not find obvious cause for complaint. Clothes were chosen with the sort of seriousness people now reserve for job interviews or passport photos. A man expected to meet his ancestors looking like himself, not like an afterthought wrapped in whatever fabric was nearest. A woman received her best brooches and keys. It would be tactless to send her into eternity without proof that she had run a competent household. Then came the little gestures, the clauses in the pact that almost seem like superstition until you listen to how reasonable they are at midnight. Someone gently closed the dead person's eyes and made sure they stayed closed, not only because open eyes upset the living, but because open eyes imply options. Eyes are for finding paths, and paths at night have a way of running back toward familiar doorways. The mouth might be closed too, not in fear of a scream, but to keep last words from leaking out uninvited. Hands were folded, not chained, just set in a posture universally understood as I am finished doing things now. The nails in the coffin. When there was a coffin, or in the beams of the burial chamber, were turned inward or bent over so they would not easily pull free. It is the kind of detail that feels like it belongs in a building manual. If you wish your structure to remain secure, dissuade it from taking itself apart. The idea of the Draugr being thwarted by inverted carpentry is unintentionally funny in undead figure, momentarily delayed because some careful farmer in life insisted on best practices that the humor is soft and fond. It imagines even the restless dead pausing to consider whether all this effort of pushing through tightly clenched boards is really necessary, or whether it might be more dignified to stay in bed. More decisive than nails was the route the body took out of the house. The ordinary front door, through which guests and neighbors and food and gossip pass, was avoided. Letting the dead walk out that way would, they believed, teach their feet the path home. So a special opening was made just once in the wall or under the eaves. The body was carried through this unfamiliar portal, turned around corners, led by a path that no living person ever used in their normal routine. This was not a chase scene, just a deliberate attempt to confuse future muscle memory. Afterwards, the opening was sealed so neatly planked, packed with clay, daubed with tar or turf that from a distance it looked as though it had never existed. The house, like a forgetful storyteller, politely lost that chapter. At the burial place, the agreement became tangible. The grave was fitted out like a modest room, each object placed with dull but deep significance. A sword laid beside its owner said, "You keep this, we will not." A ring on the finger said, "Your honor is intact." No one has shorted you. A simple wooden chair, sometimes, was set in the mound for a chieftain believed to be the kind of person who would prefer to sit while haunting. You may notice the careful logic, provide what might be demanded so that no demand is necessary. They did not aim to tempt the dead with treasure. They aimed to bind them with satisfaction. Over this carefully arranged stillness, the living spoke. The words were not always grand. Often they were as plain and as binding as an agreement over a fence line. They promised to keep the mound untouched. They promised to remember the name, at least at feasts and awkward silences. They promised, crucially, to maintain vengeance where vengeance was due, so that a murdered man did not have to clock in for overtime from the grave. In return, the unspoken expectation was clear. Stay put. Maintain your dignity. Do your watching from below the turf rather than above it. When you look at it this way, a Draugr, if it appeared, was simply a sign that someone had neglected their responsibilities. Like a form returned with red ink, gifts piled on the mound could be excessive, but even that had rules. Too little could offend. Too much might invite grave robbers, which in turn invited exactly the kind of corpse-based litigation everyone wished to avoid. There is a pleasing symmetry in the idea that moderation is not only a virtue among the living, but also a security measure against undead HR issues. A spear laid at the right angle, a cloak without unnecessary embroidery, a frankly practical pair of shoes. These were all tiny lines in the contract. You guard this place. We will not touch what is yours. The mound becomes less a prison and more a clearly defined workplace, with excellent benefits and no commute. Some dead, the stories say, needed extra wording. These were the difficult personalities, the ones whose tempers had been legendary even while pulses were involved. For them, the family might stand longer by the mound, reciting boundaries. You will not torment the cattle. You will not sit on the chest and crush your widow. You will, under no circumstances, ride the roof at night. This last one is such a specific prohibition that we can safely assume someone somewhere did ride a roof at night and it was considered memorable. The tone, though, remains astonishingly civil. It reads like a list of house rules pinned up on the mead hall wall, and yet, life being what it is, rules were sometimes bent. Someone needing silver might open an old grave just a little. A boundary stone might be nudged during a land dispute. A descendant might drink too much and comment unkindly about his ancestors' generosity or choice of battle companions. These frictions are where the Draugr stories squeeze in, not as random chaos, but as exaggerated reminders that contracts, once signed with soil, prefer not to be edited. In most accounts, the first signs of a failing pact are not dramatic at all, which makes them perfect for late-night listening. There is a thump on the roof, like a slow, thoughtful footstep. It could be ice. It could be a branch. It could be an offended grandfather testing architectural integrity. Hooves clatter where no horse is stabled. That might be wind in the rafters, unless it is someone riding the hall to get attention. A weight sits at the edge of a bed for one long breath and then is gone. Perhaps timber settling, perhaps a reminder that some promise somewhere has blurred. None of this demands screaming. It encourages, instead, a quiet family meeting at dawn. Has anyone failed to uphold their side of an old bargain? The remedy never involves dramatic combat in these older, more domestic tales. Instead, they tidy. They return the borrowed sword. They straighten the marker stone. They pour ale on the mound or bring food, not because anyone believes in the nutritional needs of the deceased, but because gestures matter. They speak aloud, apologizing in a tone that would be appropriate for scratching someone's boat. What was taken is now replaced. What was said in jest is unsaid. Please resume your rest. It is impossible to miss the resemblance to sending a gently worded email to resolve a minor bureaucratic problem. The Draugr in this light is just the escalation pathway when previous tickets were ignored. Asterisk. All of this might sound like a great deal of effort aimed at people who, technically, have stopped attending community meetings. But for the Norse, the dead were not an abstract elsewhere. They were right there in the soil, sharing the landscape, listening in their own way. Building these pacts made the world feel managed. Death was frightening enough on its own. Turning it into a series of familiar tasks, wash, dress, carry, seal, speak, remember turned raw grief into a checklist. Not a cure, but a method. When the last lamp was dimmed and the wind slid along the turf, it must have been a comfort to know that every nail pointed inward. Every door was barred and every mound had been properly negotiated with over time. The stories about terrible Draugr grew teeth and claws, because stories do that when they travel. Heroes needed opponents, poets needed drama, and illustrators needed something more active than a well-regulated cemetery. Yet under the roaring later legends, this older, quieter layer remains. The idea that if everyone behaves, the dead will too. That your grandfather is not lurking behind the cowshed because you have maintained his memory, cleaned his stone, and not repurposed his favorite axe without permission. It is a remarkably low-anxiety approach to haunting. So, when you hear the word Draugr tonight, you do not have to imagine explosions of earth and wild-eyed specters. You can, if you like, picture a tidy mound under a slow northern sky, containing a former landowner who is mildly pleased with how things have been handled. You can picture the villagers passing by, nodding respectfully, keeping their side of the arrangement with a diligence that is half fear, half affection, and half habit, yes, in that order. The arithmetic goes a little drowsy at this hour, and if, as you listen, your own room creaks softly and the air shifts, you can take it as a sign not of unrest, but of everything settling. The beams, the boards, the bones in their barrows, all adjusting into the exact places agreed upon long ago. The Pact, like this story, does not finish with a sharp line. It just continues to hold, night after night. As long as people close the eyes, turn the nails, choose the awkward door once and seal it, speak to the earth with care, and make amends when the roof gently reminds them. There's always another mound on another hill, another name to treat properly, another agreement quietly renewed. And there's always more to say about it, in the same low voice, until the words themselves grow heavy and fold, and lie as still as the grass above a contented grave. You might not think that the most comforting part of Norse mythology would be the fine print on how not to be haunted by your own grandfather, but that is essentially what we are looking at tonight. The Draugr's Pact sounds dramatic if you say it quickly, yet in its original setting it is almost soothingly bureaucratic, a set of small, Precise habits intended to keep the dead politely in their graves and the living politely out of trouble. Nothing crashes, nothing bursts from the earth. There is only a quiet understanding between house and mound, renewed every time someone carries a body out under the watchful rafters. It is the sort of arrangement that would absolutely come with a folder of neatly copied instructions if parchment had been just a little cheaper. If you find yourself still awake by the time we reach the part about doorways that are opened only once, you're welcome to stay for more Norse cemetery etiquette in future episodes. Though statistically your eyelids should have signed their own pact long before that. Imagine a dim longhouse at the edge of a fjord, where rain has been rehearsing the same soft rhythm on the roof since before dinner. Inside, the fire has grown low and thoughtful. People sit close, wool cloaks slack around their shoulders, the rushes underfoot rustling in tiny shifts. When someone mentions a name from one of the mounds up on the slope, nobody shivers or glances nervously at the door. They simply nod, as if agreeing that yes, he is still up there and that is as it should be. In the old stories, the dangerous dead, the Draugr, are often described in alarming detail, swollen, blue-black. Heavy as stones, but beneath those lurid touches is an older, calmer idea that if you treat the dead correctly, with measured respect and a touch of practical generosity, they have no professional reason to come back to work. The word Draugr itself wanders through the sagas like an underlined comment in the margin. Do not mishandle this individual. He has a temper, also an axe, and so the pact begins not in thunder, but in laundry and carpentry and the slow folding of shared expectations. The pact's roots are planted at the moment of death, when the household shifts into a deliberate, unhurried ritual. There is no frantic rushing about. This is a process that has been rehearsed in stories 100 times, the way we now rehearse emergency exits on airplanes we fully expect not to need. First, the body is washed. Not sprinkled, not waved at, but carefully bathed, as though the person were preparing for a formal visit. Warm water is poured, claws are wrung out, the stiffness of fingers is coaxed into something like rest. The face is wiped last with a gentleness that suggests someone is aware the dead might still be listening for insults. Then the hair is combed, which is more sensible than it sounds. No warrior, however deceased, wants to meet his famed ancestors with his braids in disarray. Women receive their brooches and house keys, because what kind of afterlife would it be to arrive without the visible proof that you once orchestrated the entire pantry? Each object says, wordlessly, you are recognized and your status paperwork is in order. Eyes are closed and encouraged to stay closed. Lids are smoothed with a thumb, as if one could iron out the last flicker of curiosity about the outer world. It is a simple kindness for the living, who prefer not to feel watched by pupils that note the state of the roof beams. But it is also a clause in the pact. Closed eyes look inward, toward the road ahead, not outward, measuring distances back home. The mouth, too, is arranged, as if to seal in any last sharp remark that might otherwise drift through the hall at midnight. Hands are folded, not tied. Even in fear of restless dead, restraint feels impolite. When the nails are driven into the coffin or into the wooden chamber inside the mound, they are angled inward, the point of each tiny iron spear turned against easy escape. There is no panic in it. It is simply good workmanship, the same instinct that makes a builder double-check the hinges. Somewhere, a practical mind has reasoned that if an offended ancestor decides to push up through the lid, they ought at least to find the hardware unsupportive. The way out of the house matters so much that it becomes one of the quiet marvels of this tradition. Instead of carrying the body through the front door, the familiar frame that remembers every homecoming they cut or open a special corpse door, just once, low in the wall or behind the benches, a passage that does not belong to the ordinary map of daily life. The body is carried out through this unfamiliar opening. past objects it has never seen from this angle, as though the house is politely altering the scenery, shaking the etch, a sketch of the dead person's mental layout. Afterwards, the opening is sealed tight, smeared with tar or earth, smoothed until it is indistinguishable from the rest of the wall. If you walked past it the next day, you would never guess that it was a door at all, let alone with a single solemn use. The logic is so endearingly thorough. If a Draugr should somehow feel the urge to come back, he will look for the door he never used, and in not finding it, will be gently, permanently confused. Up on the mound, the negotiations continue with the serenity of people settling the terms of a long lease. The grave is arranged as both a gesture of honor and a reminder of boundaries. Weapons are placed close at hand, but their placement is also strategic. You have your sword, so you do not need to come looking for it. You have your ring, so no one is cheating you. You have a little food and drink, so if anyone wakes you in the night, it is not because you are unreasonably hungry. For seafarers, a piece of an oar or even a whole boat might be included, not because anyone expects full-scale sailing over the cemetery, but because it would be awkward for a famed captain to be seen without appropriate equipment. The mound becomes an office furnished to the occupants' old specifications. It is understood that as long as supplies are sufficient and respect is maintained, there is no need for the management to come downstairs. The spoken part of the Pact is perhaps the sleepiest form of legalese ever composed. There are no scrolls. Everything is spoken aloud in the dusk, where words hang in the damp air and soak slowly into turf. Relatives speak to the mound as if to somebody in the next room who has just shut the door. They promise to guard the grave, to avenge wrongs, to keep the land in decent order. They might mention particular worries. You shall be avenged if you were slain. Your sons will not be cheated of their share. Your horse will not be sold cheaply. These are all ways of saying, we will handle the unfinished business so you do not have to get up. In return, there is an unspoken expectation that the dead person will adopt the role of a silent shareholder, observing, perhaps influencing luck in subtle ways, but not showing up bodily in the buyer. One saga hints that when this understanding holds, the presence in the mound is almost comforting, like a stern but invested elder silently attending a community meeting from the back row. Then there are the gifts. Not wild heaps of treasure, but carefully measured offerings. Too little and the ancestor might feel disregarded. Too much and you tempt thieves, and thieves are one of the classic ways to annoy a Draugr. A sword that everyone agrees is now the property of the dead is safer than a sword that someone is eyeing for later resale. These people lived in small communities where everyone knew which brooch had been buried with which aunt. Grave robbing was not just theft. It was a creative way to invite unpleasant nocturnal reviews. So they gave enough to feel honorable and then stopped, creating a balance in which both sides were meant to be content. The Pact is almost minimalist. No grand cathedrals, no labyrinthine theology. Just, you rest there, we'll keep our word here. Inevitably, stories linger about what happens when someone fails to hold up their end. But even those stories, in their earlier forms, move at a surprisingly unhurried pace. A Draugr rarely bursts dramatically from the earth in the oldest accounts. Instead, there are small, persisting hints that something in the contract has been flagged. A cow refuses to pass a certain corner of the field. A door, properly barred, is found open by an inch, enough for a draft, but not a robber. A weight is felt on the end of a bed, as if someone sat down to consider a topic and then changed their mind. Roof beams creak in a rhythm suspiciously like hoofbeats where no horse is kept above. These are escalations in a spectral customer service chain. They say, check the mound. They do not, in themselves, require screaming, only maintenance dots so the living, suitably nudged, go back to the paperwork. They refill an emptied mound with returned goods, muttering apologies that sound very much like, "This brooch should not have gone missing." We acknowledge the error. They correct boundary stones that had wandered a few feet during a quiet land grab. They quietly avenge an old wrong they had been putting off. Not out of flaming passion for justice, but because it is becoming clear that until they do, someone with a strong will and no pulse will keep sending reminders. It is notable how often the solution is described as essentially clerical: restore, replace, repay, reaffirm. Even the supernatural enforcer in these tales seems satisfied by precise accounting. Somewhere in some dark chamber of the mound, a ledger is closed and sleep resumes. There are, of course, more flamboyant Draugr tales in later sagas, where heroes wrestle with corpse things on moonlit hills. But for our purposes tonight, we can treat those like the dramatized version of a very mild original document. They add claws and glowing eyes the way a modern adaptation might add explosions to a story about filing taxes. Underneath, the old pact persists in its almost domestic calm, if you make sure the dead have what they were promised. If you speak clearly over the grave, and if you do not steal their equipment, you are unlikely to see them standing at the foot of your bed. If you do, it is not because the universe is chaotic. It is because someone forgot to properly angle a nail or thought no one would notice a missing spear. Seen this way, the Draugr's Pact is less a horror motif and more a form of communal bedtime story that tucks a whole village in. Each rule: close the eyes, turn the nails inward. Use the corpse door once, seal it forever, lay the gifts just so, speak the oaths. Remember the name is a small act of control in a landscape full of uncontrollable things. Storms will come when they like. Crops will fail or flourish on their own schedule. But the relationship with your dead is negotiable, manageable, as long as you are willing to be meticulously considerate. It is an oddly empowering thought to drift off with, that somewhere in the north, under grass that grows slowly in the fog, people and their ancestors arrange to coexist with minimal disturbance. Like neighbors in an apartment building who have agreed not to vacuum after 10 as the night gets deeper, even in this story. The mounds on their hills become just part of the scenery. A dog barks once and then thinks better of it. A door settles on its hinges. The living breathe in the darkened longhouse, each of them resting in the confidence that down in the earth, the honored dead are doing the same, bound not by chains or magic flames, but by the comfortable weight of kept promises. The pact does not end. It extends softly from generation to generation, renewed with each careful funeral, each straightened stone, each phrase spoken toward the quiet hill. And our tale, trailing that same gentle logic, does not close with a clang or a moral, but simply drifts thinner and slower, like smoke from an old fire, until it too lies down beside the mounds and lets the rest of the night carry on without disturbance. You might not expect that one of the most relaxing features of Norse mythology is a set of instructions for how to stop your relatives from getting up after they're buried. But that is exactly where we are going to linger tonight. It is called the Draugr's Pact, the quiet agreement between the living and the restless dead, and it has all the thrilling energy of a well-organized filing cabinet. The old stories have their dramatic versions, of course, with creaking barrows and heavy footsteps. But underneath those embellishments lies something much gentler, a village-wide promise that if everyone does the little things properly, nobody has to haunt anybody. If you're still awake a little later and somehow remember any of this, you are welcome to return for more episodes in the series. If you forget it completely because you fell asleep during the bit about coffin nails, that is actually the desired outcome and counts as full participation. In the north. The land remembers names in a very literal way. It keeps them in mounds, rounded humps of turf that sit along the slopes like extra vertebrae in the hill's spine. People walk past them daily, noting the curve that belongs to an old chieftain, the slightly lopsided rise that holds an aunt who told long stories, the neat mound for a farmer whose cows had unusually polite manners. These are not anonymous shapes. Children grow up knowing which ancestor lies where, and more importantly, which of them had a personality that suggests, "Please be especially thorough during my funeral." The word Draugr drifts through the sagas as a cautionary label for those who are strong-willed in life and might be inclined, if mishandled, to be strong-willed in the opposite direction. But listen closely and you will notice that the Tales spend just as much time describing the preventative care as they do the problems. It is less we live in fear of the dead, and more we have a detailed procedure so everyone can get some sleep. Around the longhouse fire, these procedures are folded into evening talk as calmly as advice on winter fodder. A storyteller pokes at a coal and mentions, in the same tone he'd use for weather, that the dead must be carried out by a special way, that their nails must not point back toward the house, that they should be given the tools of their trade so they do not feel under-equipped. Children memorize each step long before they ever see it in practice. No one frames it as horror. It is simply how one treats those who have finished their part of the chores. If you wanted to open a small consulting business on rural supernatural risk management, you could do worse than this community. They have discovered that the best defense against undead trouble is not silver, not fire, but an abundance of small, sensible courtesies dot so the day comes, as it must for everyone, and the pact begins almost automatically. The body is washed slowly, not briskly, with water warmed to the politely not cold temperature that suggests even in death you are a valued guest. Fingers that once held an axe or kneaded dough are uncurled and rinsed. The face is wiped with a cloth so carefully that it becomes, for a moment, just another sleeping face by the fire. During all this, there is talking, not the panicked chatter of people afraid, but the low commentary of relatives checking details. He'll want his good cloak. She should have her keys. She'd never forgive us otherwise. These remarks are not about fear. They are about accuracy. The Draugr's pact is, above all, an agreement to be precise. Then the eyes are closed, and this is where the instructions become charmingly philosophical. Eyes left open might invite wandering, someone says, so the lids are smoothed shut with a thumb. It is an odd, soft gesture, like encouraging the soul to turn its attention away from the rafters and toward whatever road people imagine lies ahead. The mouth is gently arranged, not so much to hide grimace as to keep it from looking as if the deceased is on the edge of reminding everyone to salt the fish. Shoes are laced on, firmly. You send a traveler away with shoes. It would be rude not to. The nails are driven into the coffin boards with their points turned inward, not outward. It is a small, wordless message, the carpentry equivalent of "this arrangement is one way." You can admire the practicality. They didn't have building codes, but they did have preferred nail angles for metaphysical security. All of this leads to the strangest and sleepest architectural quirk, the corpse door. Instead of escorting the dead through the familiar front threshold, which has seen so many returns from sea and field, they cut or open a new low passage in the wall. The body is carried out once, and only once, through this unfamiliar opening. Afterwards, the gap is sealed, smeared with tar or packed with turf, patiently erased until the wall remembers being solid. The idea is childishly simple and beautifully thorough. If the dead should try to come home, they will look for the door they never used, and in not finding it, become eternally disoriented. Somewhere in this logic, there is faith in the power of floor plans, and the notion that a confused ghost is a harmless one. If you have ever gone to get a snack in a hotel room in the dark and walked into a wardrobe instead, you already understand the principle. When they reach the mound, the tone is closer to a careful house move than to a dramatic burial. Objects are placed with attention to what they meant in life. A sword is laid in, yes, but in such a way that it clearly belongs to its owner now, not to any nephew with ambitious thoughts. Tools, ornaments, the odd-valued cup, each says, "You are provided for." There is no need to file a complaint. Food and drink are added, somewhere between actual sustenance and symbolic hospitality. It would be embarrassing, after all, if a respected elder became restless only because someone was stingy with the ale. The mound is built up layer by layer, turf like folded blankets. The Pact, though no one writes it down, is embedded in each clod of earth. You lie still and watch over us. We remember what we owe you. Words follow gifts, because Norse tradition is fond of saying important things out loud where the air and the soil can record them together. Standing at the edge of the new mound, someone with a clear voice states the terms. The family will avenge wrongs done to the dead. They will not plunder his grave, nor let others do so. They will keep their bargains and divide the farm as promised. They will feed the household, maintain the fences, and remember the name and story so that the person resting beneath does not fade into anonymous dirt. These promises are not dramatic speeches for a cheering crowd. They are more like those murmured agreements before sleep. The yes, I'll take care of it, that let both speaker and listener unclench. The Draugr, if he hears, is invited to become a quiet shareholder in the farm's success. Instead of an aggrieved former owner, there is a delicate equilibrium in the gifts. They must bind, not tempt. Too meager, and the dead might feel cheated. Too lavish, and living hands might be lured later to test the integrity of the mound. Everyone knows that grave robbing is less about gold and more about unnecessarily waking someone who now has fewer reasons than ever to be patient. So they give the sword that cannot be mistaken, but they do not pile an armory. They send the favorite cloak, but not the entire winter wardrobe. The idea is comfort without provocation, dignity without spectacle. It is remarkably similar to packing a modest but sufficient lunch for a long trip and trusting the traveler, not to come back just because they forgot a spoon, of course. The stories would not be stories if nothing ever went slightly off script. And this is where the edges of the Pact blur into the realm of subtle warnings. Disturbances, when they are mentioned in the older style, tend to be small. A door that was firmly shut stands just ajar in the morning, though no wind is blamed. The dog refuses to sleep near a certain wall. A dull thump is heard under the eaves, rhythmic as a slow heartbeat, but only on nights when someone has been discussing selling a piece of the ancestral land without full agreement. These are less attacks than notifications, spectral reminder emails, gently insisting that a clause in the agreement requires review. Sensible households go up to the mound with offerings and apologies and administrative corrections. The signs at the edge of sleep are not there to terrify. They exist to nudge people back into alignment with their own promises. A weight on the foot of the bed, the faint smell of earth and seaweed. A dream in which an ancestor stands just out of focus and says nothing at all. These are read not as random hauntings, but as feedback. Something is unbalanced. Perhaps someone failed to repay a debt. Perhaps a boundary stone was moved too optimistically. Vix, importantly, is very rarely a hero with a shining sword. It is a committee with clear tasks. Move the stone back, return the borrowed silver, restore the missing spear to the grave. Once the correction is made, the stories say, the disturbances ebb away with almost bureaucratic relief. Listening to this pattern, you begin to sense the final, sleepless layer of the Draugr's Pact, the quiet hypothesis about why such tales were told in the first place. In communities where everyone is closely related, Where land is limited and inheritance is tricky, it is useful to have a system that strongly discourages stealing from graves, cheating siblings, or leaving murders unaddressed. Instead of a lengthy code of law, you have a socially accepted belief that the person you wrong might get up later to file a very personal complaint. It is deterrence with moss on it, and it works because it is wrapped in care as much as in threat. The dead are tended with such attentiveness that to neglect them feels not only risky, but indecent. Seen through this lens, the Draugr's Pact becomes unexpectedly comforting. It says that death does not fling people into meaninglessness. It parks them in a clearly marked place with a defined role. The living know what to do: wash, dress, carry, seal, give, speak, remember. There's no chaos in it, only repetition. You can imagine lying in a long house, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, hearing the rain on the roof and the occasional murmur as someone adds a log to the fire. Out beyond the walls, the mounds sit in the wet grass, each one containing a set of agreements that are being kept. No one is clawing their way out tonight, not because they cannot, but because the terms are satisfactory. If the pact fails, in legend, it is almost always because someone on the living side tried to shortcut the process. They took back a gift. They broke an oath. They forgot a name. These stories exist like the notes written in the margin of a manual. Do not skip step 6, really. Yet even the worst of them can be read as arguments for restoring order. Put the sword back. Right the wrong. Speak to the grave with honesty. Once more, the solution is mundane, repetitive, calm. It is hard to sustain a shudder when the remedy for ghostly unrest is essentially paperwork and customer support, and so the Draugr's Pact drifts, gentle and oddly reassuring, through the edges of Norse myth. It is less a tale of monsters than of mutual expectations between generations. For our very quiet purposes tonight, you may let it settle over you like one of those layers of turf, each detail a thin, cool blanket of understanding. Names anchored in hills, nails angled inward, doors that opened only once and then politely forgot about it, promises murmured to the soil. If your thoughts wander, they can follow the path up and down between house and mound, tracing the same slow route the funeral bearers walked, careful step after careful step, until movement itself feels unnecessary. Somewhere in that steady back and forth, the pact holds, and the story, still capable of going on, simply grows softer, fainter, pausing with you at the edge of sleep, where nothing more is required than staying for a while, very, very still. Words follow gifts, because Norse tradition is fond of saying important things out loud where the air and the soil can record them together. Standing at the edge of the new mound, someone with a clear voice states the terms. The family will avenge wrongs done to the dead. They will not plunder his grave, nor let others do so. They will keep their bargains and divide the farm as promised. They will feed the household, maintain the fences, and remember the name and story so that the person resting beneath does not fade into anonymous dirt. These promises are not dramatic speeches for a cheering crowd. They are more like those murmured agreements before sleep, the yes, I'll take care of it, that let both speaker and listener unclench. The Draugr, if he hears, is invited to become a quiet shareholder in the farm's success, instead of an aggrieved former owner. There is a delicate equilibrium in the gifts. They must bind, not tempt. Too meager, and the dead might feel cheated. Too lavish, and living hands might be lured later to test the integrity of the mound. Everyone knows that grave robbing is less about gold and more about unnecessarily waking someone who now has fewer reasons than ever to be patient. So they give the sword that cannot be mistaken, but they do not pile an armory. They send the favorite cloak, but not the entire winter wardrobe. The idea is comfort without provocation, dignity without spectacle. It is remarkably similar to packing a modest but sufficient lunch for a long trip and trusting the traveler, not to come back just because they forgot a spoon, of course. The stories would not be stories if nothing ever went slightly off script. And this is where the edges of the pact blur into the realm of subtle warnings. Disturbances, when they are mentioned in the older style, tend to be small. A door that was firmly shut stands just ajar in the morning, though no wind is blamed. The dog refuses to sleep near a certain wall. A dull thump is heard under the eaves, rhythmic as a slow heartbeat, but only on nights when someone has been discussing selling a piece of the ancestral land without full agreement. These are less attacks than notifications, spectral reminder emails, gently insisting that a clause in the agreement requires review. Sensible households go up to the mound with offerings and apologies and administrative corrections. The signs at the edge of sleep are not there to terrify. They exist to nudge people back into alignment with their own promises. A weight on the foot of the bed, the faint smell of earth and seaweed. A dream in which an ancestor stands just out of focus and says nothing at all. These are read not as random hauntings, but as feedback. Something is unbalanced. Perhaps someone failed to repay a debt. Perhaps a boundary stone was moved too optimistically. Vix, importantly, is very rarely a hero with a shining sword. It is a committee with clear tasks. Move the stone back, return the borrowed silver, restore the missing spear to the grave. Once the correction is made, the stories say, the disturbances ebb away with almost bureaucratic relief. Listening to this pattern, you begin to sense the final, sleepless layer of the Draugr's Pact, the quiet hypothesis about why such tales were told in the first place. In communities where everyone is closely related, where land is limited and inheritance is tricky, it is useful to have a system that strongly discourages stealing from graves, cheating siblings, or leaving murders unaddressed. Instead of a lengthy code of law, you have a socially accepted belief that the person you wrong might get up later to file a very personal complaint. It is deterrence with moss on it, and it works because it is wrapped in care as much as in threat. The dead are tended with such attentiveness that to neglect them feels not only risky, but indecent. Seen through this lens, the Draugr's Pact becomes unexpectedly comforting. It says that death does not fling people into meaninglessness. It parks them in a clearly marked place with a defined role. The living know what to do: wash, dress, carry, seal, give, speak, remember. There's no chaos in it, only repetition. You can imagine lying in a longhouse, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, hearing the rain on the roof and the occasional murmur as someone adds a log to the fire. Out beyond the walls, the mounds sit in the wet grass, each one containing a set of agreements that are being kept. No one is clawing their way out tonight, not because they cannot, but because the terms are satisfactory. If the pact fails, and legend, it is almost always because someone on the living side tried to shortcut the process. They took back a gift. They broke an oath. They forgot a name. These stories exist like the notes written in the margin of a manual. Do not skip step 6, really. Yet even the worst of them can be read as arguments for restoring order. Put the sword back. Right the wrong. Speak to the grave with honesty. Once more, the solution is mundane, repetitive, calm. It is hard to sustain a shudder when the remedy for ghostly unrest is essentially paperwork and customer support. And so the Drauggr's Pact drifts, gentle and oddly reassuring, through the edges of Norse myth. It is less a tale of monsters than of mutual expectations between generations. For our very quiet purposes tonight, you may let it settle over you like one of those layers of turf, each detail a thin, cool blanket of understanding. Names anchored in hills, nails angled inward, doors that opened only once and then politely forgot about it, promises murmured to the soil, If your thoughts wander, they can follow the path up and down between house and mound, tracing the same slow route the funeral bearers walked, careful step after careful step, until movement itself feels unnecessary. Somewhere in that steady back and forth, the pact holds, and the story, still capable of going on, simply grows softer, fainter, pausing with you at the edge of sleep, where nothing more is required than staying for a while, very, very still. You might not expect the quietest corner of Norse belief to be a kind of customer service agreement with the dead, but that is where we arrive at the Draugr's Pact, the slow, practical art of persuading certain temperamental ancestors to stay comfortably in their graves, like honored guests who have been given everything they need and no reason to check out early. It is not a tale of midnight chases or flaming swords. It is, reassuringly, a sequence of small, sensible habits, like a household checklist passed down for centuries. If at any point during this explanation you happen to drift off, that is actually the correct ritual response, and you are under no obligation to report back on which step of anti-haunting procedure finally did the job first. There is the understanding that not every dead person aspires to be a Draugr. Most simply rest. Only a few, mostly those who were inconveniently powerful and emotionally invested in unfinished business, earn that uneasy reputation. Villagers learn to recognize which mounds deserve the extra respectful glance. On a low hill above a fjord, rounded barrows curve like sleeping seals against the sky. Children are told, in an entirely matter-of-fact tone, that one was a berserk. That one was your great-grandmother, the one with opinions about porridge. That one swore an impressive number of oaths. No one screams, no one clutches pearls. They just nod, file the information, and remember that certain mounds are best treated like important but retired officials, well-provisioned, occasionally consulted, never disturbed. The word Draugr itself passes from mouth to mouth in low voices, not as a shriek, but as a label on a folder. Powerful, sensitive, handle with care, around the fire. Instructions are taught as stories so unhurried that they sound like recipes. The embers sink, someone pokes them, and then that orange half-light tells how a corpse must be carried. Never through the front door, they say, in the same casual tone used to remind people to shut the gate so the goats don't eat the laundry. Never let the body see the way it came in. Children listen with wide, drowsy eyes, absorbing a full procedural manual disguised as a bedtime tale. When the time comes, they will know without being told that the dead person's head must not bump, that their feet should face away from home. That polite conversation is maintained as if escorting someone who might still be listening. The aim is not to frighten them into obedience, but to assure them that the grown-ups have a plan, which, as anyone who has been a child knows, is one of the most soothing things in the world. When a person dies, the pact begins with water. It is never thrown or splashed. It is poured into a basin that remembers other departures. The body is washed slowly, in strokes that are practical, but almost ceremonial in their steadiness. Rough hands become gentle. The hair is combed, tangles teased patiently apart. Nails are cleaned, but not cut too short because someone remarks, with a sleepy sort of logic, that it would be unkind to send a spirit away with nothing left to grow. Only when the washing is done do they speak the small phrases that anchor the pact. You are strong here. Be strong there. We send you with what is yours. Rest, and do not worry about the rest of us. It is not theology, exactly. More like speaking to someone who is almost out of earshot, just in case. Eyes are closed with thumb and forefinger, a delicate pinch of finality. The sagas warn that eyes left open might find their way back to familiar rafters, so everyone takes care with this part. Lids are pressed down until the face relaxes into an expression that suggests they have finally accepted that someone else can supervise the hay-cutting schedule. The jaw is tied gently so it will not sag open in sleep's unflattering honesty. Then shoes are put on, proper ones, with laces done up tight. It is a courtesy and a boundary at once, like handing a visitor their coat at the door. Thank you for coming. Now here is everything you need to travel on. One can imagine an ancestor, half-formed in whatever lies beyond, peering back and noting, with grudging approval, that they have not been sent barefoot. The nails in the coffin, or in the planks that cover the mound chamber, are turned inward. This is mentioned so often that it takes on the comfortable inevitability of superstition that has passed through practical engineering. Points inward say, the wood holds you. It does not encourage you outward. If anyone ever hammered one the wrong way, the entire household would likely notice and fix it at once. The way you might correct an open door on a winter night without needing to discuss the physics of heat loss. These tiny calibrations matter because they say over and over in grain and iron that the world is arranged with care. For a listener trying to fall asleep, there is something pleasing about knowing even the nails had job descriptions. Then comes the corpse door, perhaps the most drowsily ingenious part of the whole arrangement. Instead of using the familiar main doorway, a temporary opening is made. Sometimes a plank is lifted below the eaves. Sometimes a portion of turf wall is cut and swung aside. The body is carried out through this one-time exit, feet first, like a secret being slipped out of the house so quietly that routine cannot follow. Once the funeral party has gone, the opening is sealed, tarred, or bricked, wiped from the memory of the building. If the Draugr should decide to revisit old haunts, they will look for a door that technically existed, but narratively does not, and in failing to find it, may become puzzled into stillness. It is a surprisingly modern idea, like uninstalling the app that allows roaming, and it is carried out with the same tidy satisfaction. At the mound, the scene changes as softly as a cloud moving over the hill. Turf is cut in neat squares and laid aside like folded quilts. The grave pit is not just a hole. It is a room lined with stones or timbers. Into this space go the things that bind household and dead together without inviting quarrel. A sword, perhaps, laid where its owner can keep a ghostly hand on it, but angled so that drawing it would be inconvenient even for a determined spirit. The keys of a housewife who once kept every chest and storeroom under her command, placed where she can feel they're still hers, saving future daughters-in-law from supervisory visits. Simple comforts go in, a cloak against the otherworldly draft, a drinking horn, a comb. These are not bribes, just acknowledgments. You mattered. You still matter. We are not sending you away empty-handed to look resentfully through the walls. Now come the oaths spoken over the mound, and they are wonderfully specific. Someone withstanding declares that the family will defend the memory of the dead, will pay his or her outstanding debts, will not let anyone rob the grave, and will not themselves be tempted to borrow something that has been committed to the earth. Promises are made about property divisions, about foster children's care, about finishing the roof beam the deceased started last autumn. It is half legal document, half lullaby. The effect on a potential Draugr is imagined as somewhat like that on a meticulous retiree reading a well-organized pension statement. Grudging satisfaction, followed by the realization that there is no immediate need to get up and check the numbers. Some traditions even extend the pact into a kind of posthumous partnership. The mound guardian is addressed respectfully in difficult times. If we keep the boundary, they say, you keep the peace. It is not unusual in these tales for someone to go to a barrow at the edge of their fields and speak aloud, asking the buried ancestor for help against an enemy or for a good harvest. No skeleton climbs out. Instead, the story quietly assures us that loyal Draugr, bound by good oaths, can help in unseen ways, perhaps by frightening off thieves with a sense of being watched. or by leaning their invisible weight against the barn in a windstorm. It is a very Nordic solution: turn a possible security threat into a cooperative neighbor through the power of clearly defined responsibilities. Of course, because humans are humans, the sagas also preserve the footnotes about what happens when clauses are neglected. A son divides an inheritance unfairly. A neighbor steals a sword from a mound, thinking no one will notice. A king refuses to repay a favor promised long ago. The responses attributed to Draugr in these cases read less like feral outbursts and more like escalations from an extremely patient collections department. There is a chill in the hall, a weight on a chest at night, hoof beats without riders on the roof. Doors that were barred stand gently open in the morning, nothing stolen. Only the suggestion that locks are not a substitute for integrity. It is all very procedural. First a warning, then another, then, if necessary, a more pointed reminder involving rearranged furniture. The signs at the edge of sleep form a recognizable pattern. If cattle break out again and again in the same direction, people go to check whether a boundary stone has been nudged, perhaps conveniently favoring one field. If voices are heard in the storehouse, counting grain with more accuracy than the living steward, someone remembers that an oath was made about sharing food. Instead of dramatic exorcisms, the recommended solution is almost comically straightforward. Put the stone back, return the grain, acknowledge the forgotten cousin's share. Once balance is restored, the nocturnal anomalies tend to cease, suggesting that Draugr, for all their reputation, are essentially auditors with limited but effective powers. The most restful aspect of all this is that it makes death feel governed by etiquette rather than chaos. The dead are not random. They respond to whether agreements are kept. The living, in turn, have a clear path. Act decently, fulfill promises, avoid rummaging in ancient graves for accessories. It is a social technology designed to calm two anxieties at once: fear of the unquiet corpse and fear of dishonest relatives. You might say they outsourced enforcement to the possibility of a gently indignant ancestor, and as long as everyone believed in that possibility, they tended to behave just a bit better. Under the northern sky, these mounds become part of the landscape of reassurance. Snow rounds them further. Grass ties them into the hillside. A traveler passing by at dusk might see only soft shapes where the wind tugs, but locals know whose names lie within and what was promised there. On certain evenings, someone will pause, lay a hand on the turf, and murmur a greeting that doubles as a progress report. The east field is planted. The boat is repaired. Your grandson is still trying to bake bread. We're working on it. It is so ordinary, so undramatic, that it takes on the power of a ritual precisely because no one calls it that. If the Pact were ever to fail completely, the stories imply the result would be loud. But those are not the versions we are interested in tonight. We stay instead with the quiet majority of endings where everything is done as it ought to be done. The careful washing, the corpse door sealed, the inward nails, the fair words. In those households, the Draugr remains a theoretical category rather than an active participant. People sleep with the slow confidence of those who have followed the instructions on the box. Their only disturbances are the normal ones: a snoring uncle, a log collapsing in the hearth, the occasional owl offering unsolicited commentary as you lie there now. Letting this oddly precise details settle one by one, you can imagine a village in which every promise to the dead has been kept for so long that the very idea of an angry barrow dweller feels old-fashioned. The mounds are full, but also full of trust. The longhouse roof does not creak ominously. It just expands and contracts with the weather. The night is not a battlefield. It is a shared agreement that this is a good time for everyone, alive or otherwise, to rest. If your mind wanders back to the angle of the nails or the placement of the shoes, that is fine. Those things are small on purpose, easy to hold, easy to let go. The Draugr's pact continues, thorough and uneventful, and the tale, like the mound itself, can always go on a little further, but does not need to. It is enough to know that in this northern quiet, where names are whispered and doors are properly closed, nothing urgent is expected of you now but to stay still, breathe softly, and drift, as all well-settled things eventually do, deeper into sleep.